Hello everybody, this is Brent Scott and you're watching the Blitz C&E channel. So today's video is about dyno testing the Gen 3 truck intake versus the Trailblazer SS intake. And as a bonus, I also did a dyno test on a ported Gen 3 intake, which is kind of interesting. So before I roll into this video, I want to go over a couple things. Based on the previous video that I had done, there was comments on there. Now obviously, had the people probably watched the video all the way through and not just jumped to the test results, it might have answered some of the questions on the power output of the engine. So first off, let me go through this. This paints a picture of how I get the test results and what you're seeing. So the first thing, this engine is the prior engine that I used in the video that I tested the Cathedral Port LS1 cylinder head versus the Rec Port LS3 cylinder head. Same one. The engine is an LQ4 6-liter that came out of a 3/4 ton truck with over 200,000 miles on it. Now, what I did to this engine, what I didn't do to this engine, I did absolutely nothing to the bottom end. It is as is, okay? It's all original on the way that I got it. What I did change on this engine is I changed out the heads to the LS1 241 heads that were lightly ported. When I mean lightly ported, they float about 270 CFM at 550 inches of lift, which is actually the max lift on this cam that I tested with. Now, I did install new EV1 33-pound injectors because the original ones were bad. If you saw the video before, you would understand. It has a very mild cam in there. Had a 216 duration on the intake side at 50,000s and 220 duration on the exhaust at 50,000. It had a 114 LSA, which is really wide, and it only had 550 inches of lift. Now, it does have new lifters and push rods, and I also installed the trunnion kit. So these next two things I'm going to talk about are very important because this plays a big role in peak power and the peak torque that this engine's getting. So on my dyno, I do run a full exhaust system on it, okay, because I have to deal with noise constraints. So this can cost an engine anywhere from 15 to 30 horsepower, especially the more sensitive the engine is, the more power it's making, the more it's going to have effect on it. Also, it affects the VE and the top on how it pulls in the after peak power as well. So if you're trying to compare my test results to guys that are doing open header tests, just dumping the exhaust, there's going to be quite a bit of a difference in there between the two. But honestly, as I said before in my other prior video, I do 99% street strip stuff, and they would typically run a full exhaust system. So the reality is these test results are probably going to be more accurate than if you were testing an engine that had no restrictions on the exhaust, just open headers, just dumping it freely. So you could expect, now if you have a better exhaust system on your setup, you're probably going to be somewhere in the middle of an open header test versus a full length exhaust, okay? So take that in consideration. The second thing, ring blow by on this engine, we could be losing possibly 15 horsepower on it easily, all right? So when I compression tested this thing, it was anywhere from 190 PSI, and I think one cylinder was 175. What that says is that there's wear on these cylinders. It's not even. So that's going to affect the power output of this. But honestly, here's the deal with the test, all right? The trends that you see are what you need to pay attention to. So whether you have an engine that's like this, you pull it just from a junkyard and you do these things, or you have an engine that has good compression or you tighten up, these changes, the trends will follow either way. Obviously, if you have better compression, well, you're going to make more power with that particular engine. So you can trust the trends and what you're seeing in this test. So the last thing I mentioned here in the prior test, so I did all this testing about at the same time. So what it was, I bought a Holley Dominator ECU, and I bought this engine to get familiar with an LS platform using fuel injection. So at the time when I tested this and all the cylinder heads, I kind of did it for fun at that point. But honestly, I wasn't as good at tuning back then. But I can say confidently, even though my lack of tuning wasn't good at the point because I was learning the ECU, it's probably only 5 to 8 horsepower, really. Because as I've learned it, I probably could have done a better job, especially after peak power. As you look at my dyno charts, they really fall hard. What I've learned later is to do a better job on trimming the field trim later past peak power and adjusting the timing on there, which helps improve power and let it carry through longer without that severe drop that you see in these dyno charts. All right, let's move on. Okay, so I'm going to show you here an intake runner length chart that I pulled off the internet. Now, this is kind of interesting. So I let AI clean it up. So there's a couple of things that aren't accurate on there. And here's the thing. I don't want to get too far in the weeds about intake runner length tuning and harmonics. But I just wanted to show you, if you're not familiar, how lengths do change and how they respond in the RPM ranges. So as you see in this here, from 14 inches to 8 inches. So obviously the lower you go in length, the better it responds in higher RPMs, okay? Length and the diameter of the runner dictate how well it's going to run in higher RPMs. Now, this guy that this chart came from, he's doing like kick-ass NA stuff, and he's building sheet metal intakes, and he's tuning to the second harmonics. Just to put that in perspective, we are on the 4th and 5th harmonics on especially OEM intakes like in this testing, all right? So there's a difference. But if you're interested in that stuff, leave a comment, and I'll leave some links to guys that can explain this in way better detail, because it is a science and it gets very complicated. And that's not part of the video, but I just wanted to share that with you if you're not familiar, how that affects intake and runner lengths and the design of them. It's definitely interesting. I would check it out though if you really want to learn more about it. So first test that we did here. Let me pull up the dyno chart. Here is the stock intake versus the Trailblazer SS intake. Now, from what I gathered, I hadn't chopped these apart, so I took these readings off the internet, so take it with a grain of salt. But from what I gathered, the intake length on the stock intake is about 15 inches and a half, where the Trailblazer is around 14 inches in length, and that's including the cylinder head runner itself. So real quick, if you look at the dyno curve, you may notice that the stock intake is a little bit below on there. Now that's more of a dyno characteristic on my dyno, on how the load valve came in onto that engine. So what I do is I run about 5 different tests, and then I take the best average between the two. So in this particular test, it shows the stock intake being below, but reality is it's pretty much the same. There's no difference. As we move into here, and I excuse me, as I zoom in, you can see as expected, the Trailblazer SS intake definitely takes over from about 4,000 RPM up. Peak power, we're making 404 horsepower versus 396 horsepower. And the torque is better too on the Trailblazer SS. We're 412 foot-pounds of torque versus 407. I didn't know much about the Trailblazer SS intake. I knew it was a better intake, but really, as you can see in this application, it's not making that much of a difference between the two. Okay, so let's move on to the interesting, or what I thought was interesting. So this is a ported intake that I did. I did several LS intakes and did porting on there, but at the time, I didn't have a dyno to compare the results. So I had this on the shelf, but obviously as I got the dyno and things were going decent, I threw it on there and tested it. What's interesting on here is that this is the stock intake in comparison between the two. But actually, it did make quite a bit of a difference. It was a little bit more than I thought. It doesn't really affect the top end so much, but as you look through the curve, I mean, torque is definitely better. We're from 407 to 414 foot-pounds of torque. Horsepower, now we're only 2 horsepower difference, but what's interesting, if you look at the dyno graph, look how the ported intake carries longer through past peak horsepower. It's longer and straighter, so that means it's feeding the engine better, where the stock one falls off. Now, as I got better in tuning, I was able to correct that both, but that would improve on both. So that would be consistent. So the ported intake would still do a better job at top end. So I thought that was interesting. Now, obviously, as you roll back into the graph, you can definitely see that at points of the widest areas, we're almost making 10 more foot-pounds of torque through the curve, and at one point we're making about 8 horsepower more. So something to consider, before you maybe jump on the bandwagon and spend the money on the Trailblazer SS intake. Maybe consider, if you have some porting skills, work on your stock intake, especially in this application or it's a low RPM application. There's some benefit out of it. So here is the results compared to the ported intake to the Trailblazer SS intake. As you can see, in here that the ported one is actually doing better until we get about 4,700 RPM. And then obviously after that point, the Trailblazer SS intake takes over. You know, it makes more horsepower, you know, 404 over 398 horsepower. But again, look at what's interesting, how the ported intake still carries out smoother. It doesn't drop off as significantly. Now, as you look at peak torque, which is interesting, is actually we make more peak torque with the ported intake, not by a lot, but it is a better improvement over the Trailblazer SS intake. So like I'm saying, if you have a cam combination and it's going to be at a lower, like a truck cam or whatever, you know, porting intake might be the better solution for you, especially if you have the ability to do it. So the last chart I'm going to put up here between the two, this is the comparison of all three of them, so you just have an idea the differences in between, and you know, just for your curiosity. So all right, so one thing I will say, I did do some testing, and maybe I'll make a video on this, on a 5.3 liter engine, and I compared the Trailblazer SS intake versus the stock truck intake, and I used a similar cam. It had about a degree less on the intake. It was about a 213 degrees on the intake side, but it had a tighter lobe separation angle. So overall, it was relatively pretty close to the same cam as far as power operation. But what was interesting is the stock intake versus the Trailblazer. In that particular situation, they were equal. I saw no advantages of having the Trailblazer SS intake versus the stock one. And now that is because the stock intake could keep up with the demand of feeding the air. So if you're not aware of it, a smaller cylinder is easier to feed versus a larger cylinder in comparison to 5.3 versus 6 liter. So in that particular situation, the stock intake works really well. And again, this is on my dyno, and I'm running full exhaust. So take that in consideration, because if you're watching other videos doing 5.3s on an open exhaust, there's going to be differences, okay? It may allow the engine to run up higher, and that is where I want to talk real quick, where the Trailblazer SS takes over. Okay, so where the Trailblazer SS intake is necessary. So if I put it in the same engine, I put a longer duration cam in there, and it made peak power at like 6,100. So at that point, the stock intake, when I tested it, really falls off hard around 6,100, maybe a little less than that. So if you're running a longer duration cam, that's where it gives up. It can't keep up. So on this particular cam that I ran on there, the Trailblazer SS intake kept up to, you know, peak powers at 6,100, and it allowed it to go into over about 6,600, and actually it still almost carried out to about 7,000 RPM. So that's a situation where you definitely got to put a Trailblazer SS intake in there. Now, unfortunately, the question you might be asking is, well, how'd the ported intake do? Unfortunately, I developed the rod knock on this engine, so I never got to test it. I don't think that I'll bother fixing this engine, but who knows? Maybe if I get another 5.3, people are interested, I'll do that test and show it. Again, thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a comment, and we'll see you next time.